The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my driveway that Tuesday afternoon was the bright orange violation notice flapping against my front door like some kind of deranged bird trying to get inside. I had been living in Riverside Meadows, a planned community just outside Portland, Oregon, for about 3 years. The place was nice enough, with well-maintained streets, decent neighbors, and proximity to both the city and the mountains. What it also had was an HOA that seemed to exist solely to make my life difficult. The association was run by a woman named Deborah Pembroke, who fit every stereotype you could imagine. She was in her late 40s, drove a white Lexus SUV, and wore those chunky statement necklaces that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I grabbed the notice and unfolded it, already feeling my blood pressure rising. The letter was typed in that aggressive, all-caps font that HOAs seem to love. It informed me that my woodpile, which I had neatly stacked against the side of my garage, was in violation of Section 7.3.2 of the Community Guidelines. Apparently, no woodpile could exceed 4 feet in height, and mine was currently sitting at what they measured as 4 feet and 7 inches. The fine was $250. I stood there in my driveway, reading and rereading the notice, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. I had spent an entire Saturday afternoon carefully stacking that wood. I heated my house partially with a wood stove during the winter months, which saved me a decent chunk on heating bills. The woodpile was against my garage, barely visible from the street, and certainly not an eyesore by any reasonable standard. But reasonable was not a word I would use to describe Deborah Pembroke or the HOA board. I walked into my house and tossed my keys on the counter. My dog, a golden retriever named Copper, came trotting over for his usual greeting. I scratched behind his ears while pulling out my phone to call my neighbor Marcus, who lived 2 houses down. "You are not going to believe this," I said when he picked up. "Let me guess. HOA. How did you know?" "Because I got a notice too. Apparently my mailbox is the wrong shade of black. It is supposed to be midnight black, and mine is apparently charcoal black. I did not even know there was a difference." I could hear the frustration in his voice, and it matched my own. "They got me for my woodpile being 7 inches too tall." Marcus let out a long whistle. "That is absurd, even for Deborah." "I am going to fight this," I said. "This is ridiculous." "Good luck with that, man. I tried fighting a fine last year about my grass being 1/4 inch too long. They did not budge. In fact, they added another $100 for filing a frivolous appeal." After I hung up with Marcus, I decided to do some digging into the HOA guidelines. I pulled out the thick binder that had been given to me when I moved in, the one I had admittedly only skimmed. Sure enough, buried in Section 7.3.2, there it was. Wood piles could not exceed 4 feet in height. But as I read further, I noticed something interesting. The rule specified that this applied to woodpiles visible from the street or common areas. My woodpile was tucked against the side of my garage, behind a gate. You could not see it from the street at all unless you deliberately walked onto my property and around the side of my house, which meant that Deborah or one of her HOA cronies had trespassed to measure my wood. This changed things. The next morning, I took the day off work and drove to the HOA office, which was located in a small building near the community clubhouse. Deborah was there, as I knew she would be. She practically lived in that office. When I walked in, she looked up from her computer with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Adrian Vaughn," she said, my name coming out like she was greeting an old friend rather than someone she had just found. "What can I do for you?" "You can explain why you or someone from the HOA was on my property without permission," I said, keeping my voice level. Her smile faltered just a bit. I do not know what you mean. My woodpile. The one you measured and fined me for. It is behind my gate on the side of my garage. You cannot see it from the street, so someone had to come onto my property to measure it. Deborah's expression hardened. The HOA has the right to inspect properties for compliance issues. Not without notice or permission, you do not. That is called trespassing. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands on her desk. The community guidelines clearly state that the HOA reserves the right to inspect properties for violations. You agreed to those terms when you purchased your home. I pulled out my phone, where I had bookmarked the relevant section. Section 12.4 says inspections require 48 hours notice in writing. Did you provide that? For the first time, Deborah looked uncertain. I will have to review our records. You do that. In the meantime, I am not paying this fine. The measurement was obtained illegally, and the woodpile is not even visible from any common area, which means it does not fall under Section 7.3.2 anyway. I left the office feeling like I had scored a small victory, but I also knew this was far from over. Deborah Pembroke was not the type to back down easily. She had a reputation in the neighborhood for being vindictive when challenged. One resident had questioned her authority 2 years ago and suddenly found himself with a dozen violation notices over the course of a month. He eventually moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Over the next week, I heard nothing from the HOA. I thought maybe Deborah had realized she was in the wrong and decided to drop the issue. I should have known better. The following Tuesday, I got another notice. This one informed me that my fine had increased to $500 due to non-payment, and that I now had an additional violation for an improperly stored recreational vehicle. I did not own a recreational vehicle. What I did own was a small utility trailer that I used for hauling yard waste and the occasional furniture project. It was parked on the side of my house, again behind my gate and not visible from the street. I drove straight to the HOA office. Deborah was not there, but her assistant, a timid woman named Jennifer, was manning the desk. I need to speak with Deborah, I said. She is at a meeting off-site. Can I help you with something? I showed her the notice. This. I do not have an RV, and my trailer is legally parked on my own property, not visible from the street. Jennifer looked at the notice and winced. I just processed the paperwork. You would need to talk to Mrs. Pembroke about the violation itself. When will she be back? Not until Thursday. She is attending a regional HOA conference in Seattle. Of course she was. I left my contact information and asked Jennifer to have Deborah call me as soon as possible. She promised she would pass along the message, though her tone suggested she did not think it would do much good. That evening, I sat down with the HOA guidelines and really read through them this time. What I discovered was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. The rules were extensive, covering everything from the exact shade of paint you could use on your house to the types of flowers allowed in your garden. But what really caught my attention was Section 9.2, which dealt with common area access. Riverside Meadows was designed with a main entrance off Highway 217, but there was also a back access road that connected to several of the community facilities. The pool, the clubhouse, and importantly, the HOA office were all accessible primarily through this back road. The main entrance could get you to the residential areas just fine, but if you wanted to reach any of the community amenities, you needed to use the back access road, and this back access road ran directly past my property. More specifically, it ran along the back edge of my lot. When I had purchased the house, I had also purchased a small additional strip of land that extended my property line. It was just an extra 20 feet or so, and I had bought it because it gave me more privacy and a bit more yard space for Copper to run around in. The previous owner had not owned that strip. It had been community property until the HOA decided to sell it off to raise funds. I had jumped at the opportunity. What this meant was that a portion of the back access road actually crossed my property. There was an easement in place that allowed the HOA and residents to use that section of road, but I owned the land underneath it. An idea began to form in my mind. It was petty. It was probably going to cause a lot of problems, but after dealing with weeks of harassment from Deborah and her HOA board, I found I did not particularly care. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First, I called a real estate attorney I had used when buying the house. His name was Patrick Shore, and he was known for being thorough and creative when it came to property law. "Tell me about easements," I said when I got him on the phone. "That is a broad topic. What specifically do you want to know?" I explained my situation, the HOA violations, the trespassing to measure my woodpile, and the retaliatory fines I had been receiving. Then I explained about the access road and my property line. Patrick was quiet for a moment. "You are thinking about blocking the easement. Can I do that?" "Well, it depends. Easements can be terminated or challenged under certain circumstances. If the HOA is violating the terms of the easement, for example, or if they are using it beyond what was originally agreed upon, you might have grounds. But Adrian, I have to warn you, this could get messy." "It is already messy. They are fining me for violations they had to trespass to discover. I just want to know my options." We talked for another 30 minutes. Patrick agreed to review my property deed, the easement agreement, and the HOA guidelines. He said he would get back to me within a few days with his assessment. While I waited for Patrick to do his research, I decided to do a little investigating of my own. I started talking to my neighbors, asking them about their experiences with the HOA. What I discovered was troubling. Nearly everyone had a story. Deborah had fined the Johnsons for having the wrong type of decorative rocks in their front yard. She had threatened the Martins with legal action because their teenage son had friends who parked on the street too often. She had even tried to force Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow, to remove her bird feeders because they attracted pests. But the most interesting story came from Marcus. He told me that his brother-in-law worked for the county planning department. According to him, the HOA had been making modifications to the back access road without proper permits. They had widened it by several feet about a year ago and had added new lighting and signage. None of this had been approved by the county. This was exactly the kind of information I needed. Patrick called me back on Friday afternoon. "I've got good news and bad news," he said. "Give me the bad news first. The easement is pretty standard, and under normal circumstances, you would not have grounds to block it or terminate it. It is considered a necessary access easement for the community. And the good news? The good news is that the HOA has been making unauthorized improvements to the road, which extends beyond the scope of the original easement. They are supposed to maintain the road in its original condition, but by widening it and adding features, they have technically violated the terms. Also, if they have been trespassing on your property to conduct inspections without proper notice, that is another violation. You could potentially use these issues as leverage. Leverage for what? To get them to drop the fines and leave you alone. You could threaten to file a complaint about the easement violations and the trespassing. The HOA does not want to get into a legal battle, especially if they are in the wrong. What if I wanted to take it further? What if I actually wanted to block the road? Patrick sighed. Adrian, I would advise against that. It would be seen as a disproportionate response, and you would almost certainly end up in court. Even if you were technically within your rights, a judge might rule against you on the grounds that you are causing undue hardship to the community. But could I do it? Legally? Technically, yes. If you wanted to terminate the easement based on their violations, you could give them notice and then do whatever you wanted with your property. But you would need to be prepared for the consequences. I thanked Patrick for his help and told him I would think about my options. But in my mind, the decision was already made. Deborah Pembroke had made my life miserable for weeks over a few inches of woodpile height. She had trespassed on my property, issued bogus fines, and shown no willingness to be reasonable. If she wanted to play hardball, I was ready to swing for the fences. That weekend, I got to work. First, I restacked my woodpile. I measured it carefully this time, making sure it was exactly 4 feet tall. I even took photos and videos documenting every inch. Then I moved my trailer to a different location, also ensuring it was in compliance with every possible HOA regulation. Next, I started preparing for the main event. I rented a small excavator and had it delivered to my house on Monday morning. My plan was simple. I was going to dig up a section of my property that happened to be right where the access road crossed my land. I would not touch the road itself, at least not initially. I was just going to do some landscaping on my own property. If that landscaping happened to make the road impassable, well, that was just an unfortunate side effect. But before I did any digging, I needed to cover my bases legally. I had Patrick draft a formal letter to the HOA, notifying them that they were in violation of the easement terms and that I would be conducting work on my property that might impact access. The letter was delivered on Monday afternoon via certified mail. Tuesday morning, I fired up the excavator. I started digging a trench along the back edge of my property, right where the access road ran. The trench was about 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep. I was careful to stay on my side of the property line, but the effect was immediate. There was no way any vehicle could pass on the road without crossing the trench. By noon, my phone was ringing off the hook. I ignored the calls. I knew who they were from. Instead, I kept working, piling the excavated dirt on my side of the trench. Copper thought it was the greatest thing ever, running back and forth along the edge of the trench and barking excitedly. Around 2 in the afternoon, Deborah Pembroke herself showed up. She pulled up in her white Lexus, parked on the road, and marched toward me. Her face was red, and she was moving with the kind of determined anger that suggested she was barely keeping herself under control. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded. I shut off the excavator and climbed down. "I am doing some landscaping on my property. Is there a problem?" "You are blocking the access road. This is community property. Actually, this is my property. The road crosses my land via an easement which your HOA has violated multiple times. I notified you yesterday that I would be doing work here. You cannot do this. This is the only way to access the clubhouse and the office." Well, you should have thought about that before you started harassing me with bogus fines and trespassing on my property. Deborah looked like she was about to explode. "I am calling the police. This is illegal." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "While you are at it, you might want to mention the unpermitted work your HOA did on this road last year. I am sure the county would be interested in hearing about that." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Finally, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her car. I watched her drive away, then climbed back onto the excavator and got back to work. True to her word, Deborah called the police. 2 officers showed up about an hour later. I explained the situation to them, showed them my property deed, the easement agreement, and the letter from my attorney. They looked at the trench, looked at the documents, and then looked at each other. "This is a civil matter," one of them finally said. "We cannot force you to stop working on your own property. If the HOA has an issue with it, they need to take it up in court." "But he is blocking community access," Deborah said. She had followed the police officers back to my property. "People need to use this road." "Madam, according to these documents, this is his property. If there is a dispute about the easement, you need to resolve it through legal channels." The officers left, and Deborah stood there glaring at me. "You are going to regret this," she said. "The only thing I regret is buying a house in a community run by someone like you," I replied. Over the next few days, chaos erupted in Riverside Meadows. Residents who were used to accessing the clubhouse and pool through the back road now had to drive all the way around through the main entrance and then navigate through the residential streets. It added a good 10 minutes to the trip. The HOA office was essentially cut off. Deborah had to park on the main road and walk a quarter-mile to reach the building. My neighbors had mixed reactions. Some thought I was a hero for standing up to the HOA. Others thought I was being petty and causing unnecessary problems. I got a few angry phone calls and a lot of dirty looks when I left my house. Marcus stopped by on Wednesday evening. "You actually did it," he said, looking at the trench with something between awe and disbelief. "I did. Deborah is losing her mind. She has been calling emergency HOA board meetings. She tried to get an injunction against you, but apparently no judge would grant it without a full hearing." "Good. Adrian, man, I support what you are doing. I really do. But are you sure you are ready for how far this might go?" "Deborah is not going to just let this slide. I know. But I am tired of being pushed around. She has been harassing me for weeks over nothing. She trespassed on my property. She issued fraudulent fines. Enough is enough." Marcus nodded slowly. "Just be careful. People like her. They do not fight fair." He was right about that. On Thursday, I received a notice from the HOA informing me that I was being fined $10,000 for willful obstruction of community access and destruction of community property. They also threatened to place a lien on my house if I did not immediately restore access and pay all outstanding fines. I forwarded the notice to Patrick, who called me an hour later. "They are bluffing," he said. "They cannot fine you $10,000 without due process, and they certainly cannot claim destruction of community property when you were working on your own land. I will draft a response, but Adrian, you need to be prepared for this to go to court. Let it go to court. I have got documentation of everything they have done." "Okay, but there is something else you should know. I did some digging, and it looks like Deborah Pembroke might have a personal financial interest in the HOA. There are some expenses on the community books that do not quite add up. I think she might be using HOA funds for personal use." This was interesting. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet. But if we end up in court, I could request a full audit of the HOA finances as part of the discovery process. If there is something shady going on, we will find it." Things escalated further over the weekend. A group of residents organized a meeting at one of their homes to discuss the situation. I was not invited, but Marcus was, and he filled me in on what happened. The community was divided. Some residents were furious with me for blocking the road. Others were angry at Deborah for letting things get to this point. A few people even spoke up about their own negative experiences with the HOA. During the meeting, Deborah tried to rally support for legal action against me. She painted me as a troublemaker who was holding the community hostage. But when someone asked about the unpermitted road work and the trespassing allegations, she became defensive. She claimed that everything the HOA had done was within their rights and that I was twisting the facts. Not everyone was convinced. On Monday morning, I received a surprising phone call. It was from a woman named Grace Thornton, who lived on the other side of the development. She introduced herself as a member of the HOA board, though she admitted she had been a fairly passive member up until now. "I want to talk to you about what is happening," she said. "Can we meet somewhere neutral?" "Maybe the coffee shop on Maplewood Avenue," I agreed, curious about what she wanted. We met an hour later. Grace was in her mid-30s, dressed in business casual attire, and had the air of someone who was tired of corporate politics. "I am going to be blunt," she said once we had our coffees. "Deborah is out of control. I joined the HOA board 2 years ago because I wanted to help maintain property values and keep the community nice. But over time, I have watched her become more and more aggressive. She treats the HOA like her personal fiefdom." "I noticed," I said dryly. "What you did blocking the road, it was a bold move, maybe too bold, but it has brought things to a head. Other board members are starting to ask questions." We pulled some financial records over the weekend, and there are some serious irregularities, expenses that do not make sense, payments to vendors that might not even exist. "You think she is embezzling?" "I think something is going on, and it is not good. But here is the thing. If this turns into a huge legal battle, it is going to cost everyone money. The HOA will have to spend money on lawyers. You will have to spend money on lawyers, and in the end, nobody wins except the attorneys." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting a deal. You restore access to the road, and we remove Deborah from the board and drop all fines against you. We will also implement new rules about inspections and notifications, so this kind of thing cannot happen again." I considered her offer. It was tempting. The whole point of blocking the road was to force the HOA to take me seriously, and it seemed like I had accomplished that. But there was still the matter of Deborah's potential embezzlement. "What about the financial irregularities?" I asked. "We will launch a formal audit. If we find evidence of wrongdoing, we will take appropriate action. That might mean legal action, it might mean involving law enforcement, but we will handle it properly." "And if I say no," Grace sighed. "Then this goes to court, costs everyone a fortune, and probably ends with you having to restore access anyway. You would win some battles, but the war would be expensive and exhausting." She made a good argument. I told her I would think about it and get back to her within 24 hours. That evening, I talked it over with Patrick. He agreed that Grace's offer was reasonable, especially the part about auditing the finances. "If Deborah has been embezzling, that is a criminal matter," he said. "The HOA could press charges, and you would not be responsible for making that happen. Plus, you would get what you want, the fines dropped and protections against future harassment." I also called Marcus to get his take. "Take the deal," he said immediately. "You have made your point. Deborah is on her way out. You have won." The next morning, I called Grace and told her I would accept the terms, with one addition. I wanted a written agreement, signed by the entire HOA board, that outlined the new rules and confirmed that all fines against me were permanently dropped. Grace agreed. It took a week to draft the agreement and get all the necessary signatures. During that time, I left the trench in place. The community continued to grumble about the inconvenience, but I wanted to make sure the deal was solid before I did anything. Finally, on the following Monday, the agreement was signed. That afternoon, I rented a small bulldozer and filled in the trench. By evening, the access road was fully restored. I made sure to pack the dirt down properly and even reseeded the area with grass. Deborah was furious. According to Marcus, who seemed to have sources everywhere, she had been blindsided by the other board members. They had held a vote to remove her as president of the HOA and had passed it by a margin of 4-1. She was still technically a board member, but she had been stripped of most of her authority. The financial audit was scheduled to begin the following week. Grace kept me updated on the progress. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. Over the past 3 years, Deborah had been systematically siphoning money from the HOA. She had created fake invoices for landscaping and maintenance work that was never performed. She had paid herself consulting fees that were not authorized by the board. In total, she had embezzled close to $75,000. The board voted unanimously to remove her completely and to refer the matter to law enforcement. Within days, the police were involved. Deborah was arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft. It made the local news. The headlines read, HOA president arrested for embezzling community funds. I would be lying if I said I did not feel a certain satisfaction seeing her mugshot on the evening news, but mostly I just felt relieved. The nightmare was over. The new HOA board, led by Grace, was a vast improvement. They implemented reasonable policies, including a requirement that all inspections be scheduled with 48 hours notice, and that any fines be subject to review by multiple board members before being issued. They also established a more transparent budgeting process to prevent future embezzlement. As for me, I went back to my normal life. I stacked my woodpile to exactly 4 feet, just to be safe. I kept my trailer neatly stored on the side of my house. I paid my HOA dues on time and attended the occasional community meeting. A few months later, I ran into Grace at the grocery store. She thanked me again for bringing the issues with Deborah to light. You know, if you had not made such a fuss, we might never have looked into the finances, she said. You did the community a favor. I was just trying to protect my property, I said. Well, you did more than that. You held us accountable. The legal proceedings against Deborah took almost a year. She eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her mugshot, her sentencing, everything was a matter of public record. The woman who had once terrorized the neighborhood with petty fines and power trips was now a convicted felon. I never saw her again after her arrest, and I was fine with that. The new board continued to do a good job managing the community. Property values stayed stable, the common areas were well maintained, and most importantly, people were left alone to enjoy their homes without constant harassment. My woodpile stayed at exactly 4 feet. I never got another violation notice. Life in Riverside Meadows returned to normal, or at least as normal as life in an HOA community could be. Looking back, I do not regret what I did. Was it petty to block the access road over a woodpile fine? Maybe. But sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they hide behind the authority of a homeowners association. Deborah Pembroke thought she could push me around because she had a title and a rule book. What she did not count on was someone who was willing to read that rule book just as carefully as she did, and who was not afraid to use their own property rights as leverage. The whole experience taught me a valuable lesson about power and accountability. HOAs can be useful organizations when they are run properly. They can maintain standards, organize community events, and handle shared expenses. But they can also become tools of petty tyranny when the wrong people are in charge. It takes vigilance and sometimes confrontation to keep them in check. Marcus and I still laugh about the whole thing sometimes. He eventually got his mailbox repainted, though he made sure to verify the exact shade with 3 different board members before doing it. Mrs. Chen kept her bird feeders up, and no one bothered her about them anymore. The Johnsons kept their decorative rocks. The Martins' teenage son still had friends over, and they parked on the street without incident. The back access road remained open, and people used it daily without giving it a second thought. Most of them probably had no idea what had happened. That for a brief period, that road had been the center of a community drama that ended with an arrest and a complete overhaul of the HOA leadership. Every time I drive past that spot where the trench used to be, I smile a little. The grass grew back nicely. You would never know anything had happened there. But I know. And I know that I own that piece of land, and I know that sometimes standing your ground, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming opposition, is the right thing to do. One afternoon in late spring, almost a year after the whole incident, I was out working in my yard when a moving truck pulled up to a house 3 doors down. A young couple was moving in, their first home by the looks of it. They were excitedly directing the movers, talking about paint colors and furniture arrangements. I walked over to introduce myself. The man's name was Andrew, and his wife was named Sarah. They were thrilled to be in the neighborhood, talking about how beautiful and well-maintained everything was. "The HOA seems really organized," Andrew said. "We got a welcome packet and everything. They seem on top of things." "They are good now," I said. "Just make sure you read all the guidelines carefully." "Oh, we will. We do not want to get in trouble or anything." I smiled. "Just remember, it is your house. Do not let anyone push you around." They looked a bit confused by that comment, but they nodded politely. They would understand eventually. Everyone who lives in an HOA community learns the same lessons sooner or later. As I walked back to my house, Copper running ahead of me, I felt genuinely content. My home was my castle, my woodpile was perfectly legal, and the neighborhood was finally being run by reasonable people. It had taken a fight to get there, a fight that involved trenches, lawyers, and ultimately a criminal investigation. But it had been worth it. The sun was setting over the mountains to the west, casting long shadows across my yard. I had a cord of wood stacked neatly against my garage, exactly 4 feet high, ready for the next winter. My trailer was properly parked. My grass was mowed to the appropriate length. Everything was in perfect compliance with the HOA rules. But the difference now was that those rules were enforced fairly and reasonably. There were no more surprise inspections, no more ticky-tack violations designed to generate fine revenue. The HOA had gone back to its intended purpose, maintaining the community, not micromanaging it. Grace Thornton ended up serving as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down to focus on her growing business. Under her leadership, the community thrived. She organized neighborhood barbecues, started a community garden project, and even got the HOA to install a dog park, which Copper absolutely loved. The embezzlement case against Deborah became something of a cautionary tale in HOA circles throughout the Portland area. Other communities started implementing better oversight and financial controls. Some even reached out to Grace to ask for advice on how to run an HOA properly. As for Deborah herself, she served her time and was released on parole after 2 years. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to a different state, somewhere far away from Oregon. Good riddance. The whole experience left me with a much clearer understanding of property rights, easements, and HOA law than I ever wanted to have. But that knowledge proved useful. I started helping other neighbors who had disputes with HOAs in their communities. I was not a lawyer, but I could point people in the right direction and help them understand their rights. One thing I learned is that HOAs count on homeowners being passive. They count on people just paying the fines, following the rules, and never questioning the authority of the board. When someone does push back, when someone actually reads the bylaws and understands the law, the whole power dynamic shifts. My property value actually increased after everything settled down. The negative publicity around Deborah's arrest was offset by the positive changes in how the HOA was run. Potential buyers saw a well-managed community with reasonable rules and good oversight. Several houses sold quickly, with new families moving in. I ended up serving on the HOA board myself for a term, just to make sure the good practices continued. It was not something I particularly wanted to do, but I felt a responsibility to the community. During my time on the board, we updated several outdated rules, streamlined the violation process, and established an appeals procedure that was actually fair. The Woodpile rule, ironically, remained unchanged. 4 feet was still the maximum height. But the enforcement of that rule became reasonable. If someone's woodpile was a few inches over, they would get a friendly reminder, not an immediate fine. The goal was compliance and community standards, not revenue generation. Years passed, and life moved on. I eventually got a new job that required less travel, which meant I was home more often. I dated, had relationships, and eventually met someone special at a community event, of all places. Her name was not Grace or Deborah, thankfully. We took things slow, but it felt right. Copper got older, grayer around the muzzle, but still loved his walks around the neighborhood. Other residents knew him by name. Kids would ask if they could pet him. He became something of a mascot for the community. The back access road continued to serve its purpose, providing easy access to the clubhouse, pool, and other amenities. The maintenance was kept up properly, and the HOA made sure to respect the property rights of the homeowners whose land the road crossed. I never had another violation notice. Not once. My property was always well maintained, not because I was afraid of the HOA, but because I took pride in my home. That is how it should be. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the fight was never really about a woodpile. It was about respect, about not being bullied, about standing up for what was right. Deborah Pembroke had turned the HOA into her personal power trip, and someone needed to stop her. I just happened to be the person who was stubborn enough to do it. The method I chose, blocking the access road, was extreme. I will admit that. But sometimes extreme situations call for extreme measures. The legal and diplomatic approaches had failed. Deborah had ignored reason, ignored the rules she was supposed to uphold, and had abused her position. Drastic action was necessary to force a change. Would I do it again? Probably. Would I recommend it to others? That depends. Every situation is different. But I would always recommend that people know their rights, understand the rules they are subject to, and never be afraid to stand up to unjust authority. The community thrived in the years after Deborah's departure. We had summer block parties, holiday decorating contests, and charity drives. The HOA facilitated these events rather than trying to control every aspect of community life. It became what it was always meant to be, a tool for neighbors to work together, not a weapon for one person to wield against others. I continued to heat my home with wood during the winters. There was something satisfying about it, about the work of stacking the wood in the fall and then burning it through the cold months. And every time I stacked that wood, making sure it was exactly 4 feet high, I remembered the fight. I remembered standing my ground. I remembered winning. The trench was long gone, filled in and covered with grass that grew thick and green. But the memory of it remained, a reminder that sometimes you have to dig in, literally and figuratively, to protect what is yours. My neighbors and I developed a stronger sense of community through the whole ordeal. We looked out for each other more. We communicated better. We were not afraid to speak up when something was not right. That was Deborah's unintended legacy. By being such a tyrant, she had actually brought us together in opposition to her. And that solidarity continued even after she was gone. I often thought about what might have happened if I had just paid that first fine. If I had simply restacked my woodpile a few inches lower and moved on with my life. Deborah would have continued her reign of petty tyranny. She would have continued embezzling. Other neighbors would have continued to suffer under her arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement. Sometimes one person standing up can change everything. It was not about being a hero. It was just about refusing to accept something that was wrong. The legal bills were not cheap. Even though I won in the end, even though the HOA dropped all fines and I did not have to go to court, I still paid Patrick for his work. It was worth every penny. Good legal advice is invaluable, especially when you are up against an organization with resources and authority. I framed the agreement that the HOA board signed, the one that dropped all my fines and established new rules for inspections and due process. It hung in my home office as a reminder, not a reminder of conflict, but a reminder that justice can prevail when you are willing to fight for it. Years after everything settled, I would occasionally get calls from people in other HOA communities who were having similar problems. Word had spread somehow about what had happened in Riverside Meadows. I would share my story, offer what advice I could, and always emphasize the importance of knowing the rules and documenting everything. Some of those people went on to fight their own battles with their HOAs. Some won, some lost, some reached compromises. But they all learned the same lesson I did. You do not have to accept injustice just because it comes from an official-sounding organization with fancy letterhead. The community continued to evolve and improve. We got new streetlights that were more energy efficient. The pool was renovated. The clubhouse got updated. These were the things the HOA should have been focusing on all along, rather than measuring woodpiles and issuing punitive fines. My relationship with the community grew stronger. I was no longer just a resident who had caused a commotion. I was someone who had helped bring about positive change. People respected that. They knew that if something was wrong, someone would speak up. That culture of accountability remained. Copper eventually passed away, as all dogs eventually do. The neighborhood mourned with me. People brought flowers and cards. Kids drew pictures of him. It was touching to see how much he had meant to others, how he had become part of the fabric of the community during his years walking these streets. I got another dog eventually, a rescue named Bailey. She was different from Copper, smaller and more energetic, but just as loving. She quickly became a fixture in the neighborhood as well, carrying on Copper's legacy of being the friendly dog everyone knew. Life moved on as it always does. The drama with the HOA became history, a story that was occasionally retold at neighborhood gatherings but no longer defined daily life in Riverside Meadows. That was how it should be. The fight was necessary, but once it was won, it was time to move forward. I still live in that house, on that same street in Riverside Meadows. My woodpile still sits against my garage every fall and winter, neatly stacked at exactly 4 feet high. The back access road still runs past my property, used daily by residents heading to the pool or clubhouse. And everything is peaceful. The whole experience made me a stronger person. It taught me about standing up for myself, about the importance of knowing your rights, and about the power of not backing down when you know you are right. These were valuable lessons that I carried into other areas of my life. I advanced in my career, partly because I had learned to advocate for myself better. I negotiated harder, stood my ground when necessary, and did not let myself be pushed around. The confidence I gained from facing down the HOA served me well in boardrooms and business negotiations. My personal life improved too. I was better at setting boundaries, at communicating clearly about what I would and would not accept. The relationship I had been building grew into something solid and lasting, built on mutual respect and honest communication. Sometimes I drive past that section of road and think about the trench. I think about the look on Deborah's face when she realized she could not bully me into submission. I think about the phone calls with Patrick, the meetings with Grace, the careful documentation of every violation and every response. It was a lot of work, a lot of stress, but it had been worth it. The community I live in now is better for what happened. The HOA is more accountable, more transparent, more reasonable. Residents feel like they have a voice, like they can question decisions without fear of retaliation. That is how it always should have been. And my home is still my castle, a place where I can stack my wood, park my trailer, and live my life without arbitrary interference from power-hungry board members. That freedom, that sense of security in my own property, is something I will never take for granted again. The story of the Woodpile and the blocked road became something of a legend in Riverside Meadows. New residents would sometimes hear about it and ask me if it was true. I would confirm that yes, it happened, and yes, I really did dig a trench across the access road. Their reactions varied from shock to admiration to disbelief, but the important part was not the dramatic gesture of blocking the road. The important part was what came after: accountability, reform, justice. The road being blocked was just a means to an end, a way to force people to pay attention to problems they had been ignoring. In the end, that is what it takes sometimes. Not quiet compliance, not polite requests that get ignored, but bold action that demands attention and forces change. I do not advocate for unnecessary conflict, but I do advocate for standing your ground when you are in the right. My property value continued to appreciate over the years. The neighborhood remained desirable, partly because word got out that the HOA was well run and reasonable. People wanted to live in a place where rules made sense and were enforced fairly, not capriciously. I eventually paid off my mortgage, a milestone I celebrated quietly with close friends. The house was truly mine now, not just in principle but in practice. No bank held a note on it, and no tyrannical HOA president could threaten it with liens or legal action. Life in Riverside Meadows settled into a comfortable rhythm. Seasons changed, neighbors came and went, children grew up and new families moved in. The community evolved naturally, organically, the way communities should. And through it all, the lessons learned from that conflict with Deborah remained relevant. The story ends not with drama but with peace. With a well-maintained home, a properly run HOA, and a community that learned the value of accountability and fair governance. The woodpile that started everything still gets stacked every year, at exactly 4 feet, a quiet monument to the fight that changed everything and the man who refused to back down.